Hello all. So we have covered calf management and heifer management during previous lectures, and today we start the management of the dairy cow. Right. So dairy cow management is the third and last topic. So by now you should know all of these. Give me a second. So by now you should know when to wean, when to breed, when to calve, the all the body weight ratios, age, and all this, right? So right now we are here, right? So we are right about here, and we'll be covering the rest of these topics during the next few lectures, right? So you already know about this, the life cycle, right? Different time points, major landmark events, right? So you know all this, right? So I'm not going to spend time on this, right? So we haven't come to that topic yet, right? So you know all these, right? So you know the intercalving interval, right? We've briefly talked about it. We'll go into details on that, right? Right. So you know the seasonality, right? I mentioned this earlier. This cycle is based on the natural seasonality, right? So during winter time, nutrients are low, therefore animal is not so active, right? Metabolism wise, so right, that's when the animal is kind of resting. However, harboring a pregnancy, and then it's spring calving, and then nutrient levels go up, forages grow with spring and summer, then nutrition levels go up in cattle, breed and become pregnant and stay pregnant throughout autumn and winter, fall or autumn and winter, and then spring calving, right? So that is the natural cycle in a temperate country, and even in a tropical country, you don't see this seasonality. However, in certain situations, you can see seasonality due to rain season and dry season, right? Even in Sri Lanka, towards the northern province, eastern province, where the dry period is pronounced, you can see that animals won't come into heat during the dry period because of the low nutrition and adverse weather conditions. But as weather and nutrient levels go up, it improves and they come into heat, right? So that kind of thing you can observe in Sri Lanka as well. Right. So you should have a good understanding of this, right? So this is the intercalving interval that I was talking about, intercalving interval or intercalving period. This is made up of, you can say, either the lactation period plus dry period or pregnant and non-pregnant period, right? Also called the open period, which is further divided into voluntary waiting period and breeding period. We'll go into details on those, right? So basically intercalving interval, intercalving, right? Interval between two consecutive carvings, right? So this should ideally be 1 year, right? Because it's seasonality, because of the seasonal nature in nature, right? So every spring there will be a calf, meaning it's a 12-month interval, right? Okay, so I would have mentioned most of these terms as we went on, right? But you should know this. If you don't know these terms, look them up. What's meant by a pre-fresh cow? What's a post-fresh cow? What's the what you mean by the early fresh period? What is freshening? What are springer cows, right? Transition cow, so you should all should know these terms, right? Steer, bull. So these are some dairy specific jargon that you have to be familiar with. We can always quiz you on these terms, right? And you might see them during in exams also. So you should, if you don't know the term, right? If I ask you Okay, list 5 clinical conditions in fresh cows or in transition cows. I'm expecting you to list down clinical conditions specifically in fresh cows. If you just tell me 5 diseases in cows, you won't get marks, right? So you need to know these terms, what is meant by each of these terms, right? So under this topic, dairy cow management, this is part one. We will be talking about the milking cow, the dry cow, and the transition cow mainly. And under each of these topics, we will also be talking about their nutrition, housing, milking management in this group, and animal welfare. And we'll finish the series off with culling and herd composition. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, the intercalving interval is either lactation plus dry period, which is 1 year, or pregnant plus non-pregnant period, which again should ideally be 1 year, right? So both of these should ideally be 1 year. You should know by now, how to fill these spaces, right? So these called the open period, right? So do a calculation and see. So as you can would imagine, this is not fixed, right? Lactation period can be 150 days, it can be 200 days, it can be 305 days, it can be 400 days, right? However, this is fixed, right? So this is fixed. Gestation length is relatively fixed, because anything in nature you can't draw a line and say, okay, this is exactly this many days, right? But it's fluctuates within a relatively short period, maybe as early as 265 days and maybe late as 285 to 90 days in extreme cases, right? But usually averages around 275 to 80 days. As time goes by, people have been selecting for shorter gestation lengths. So nowadays it's not uncommon to see um, cows with gestation periods shorter than even 75 days, right? But traditionally it was around 280 to 285 days. Right, so do a calculation and see, if you want to maintain an intercalving interval of 1 year, right, what is the maximum open period you can afford to have, right? So if the open period goes beyond a certain number of days, you cannot get a 1 year intercalving interval, right? The period between two calvings would be longer than um, 1 year, right? So what is the critical event that determines this, right? So why can't you get a short open period, right? That is actually a problem not only in Sri Lanka but the all over the world. That the open period is longer than what you ideally want it to be. So think about that. What is that critical event that delays or that prolongs the open period and prolongs the intercalving interval, right? Just give it a thought. Okay, right. So this lactation period, right? So this is dry period, the lactation period. We divide into three segments called the early lactation period, mid lactation period, and late lactation period, right? So we do this for a reason, mainly for easy management purposes, right? So just think about this. Why would you want these three groups to be managed differently, right? What might be different between these groups, right? So I mean, if everything was the same among these three groups, then there is no point categorizing them as early, mid, and late lactation cows, right? But we categorize them into three different groups because something is different, right? Management wise. So if management is different, that means their physiology may be different. So think about those for a second. Right? So pause the video, think about those, and come back. Right? So I hope you paused the video and gave it some thought. Right? So think in terms of production, right? Reproduction, health, demands, right? Nutritional demands, right? So think in those terms, and in the situation of the natural seasonality, right? So think of that seasonal effect also, right? So which group do you think is the highest producing group, daily milk yield wise, right? So it's usually this group. And which group do you think is the lowest production group? That would be the late lactation group. So if this group has high production levels, which means its natural demands, nutrition demands are higher. If this group has lower production, that means their demands are lower. They will eat less, right? They will eat less, both quantity and quality wise. You can lower it, right? So that you can get a higher profit margin, right? So all this is to do with economics, right? So these are the reasons why we categorize them differently. So think about those, what differences those might be, right? And why we categorize them differently, right? uh, okay, so basically four groups. Of course, even within these groups, especially between in this group, you might further divide some of these groups, right? And then there will be other grouping systems also, not only by stage of lactation, but they may be categorized on different criteria. Can you think of those? What those other criteria might be? Right, so it's to do with production, right? So think about this. Okay, let's say there are most of these animals are high producers. Let's say, when I say high producers, 40 liters and above a day production, and there are a few animals who are still in early lactation, however they are low producers, say 10 liters for some reason, right? So what do you think makes sense, to have these low producers in the early lactation group, just because they are gestation, after gestation they are just fresh cows, or would it make more sense to group them with this group or this group, right? So it makes more sense to group them here, because these guys are probably receiving a low quality low quantity diet, right? So like I said, so there are certain farms that categorize animals based on their lactation levels also, right? Not just gestation length, right? Okay, good. Right. So I hope your answers had these components, right? So early lactation, like I said, you can see milk production peaks during early lactation, right? So initially it's lower, then it peaks, right? Then during mid lactation it comes down, and in late lactation it comes all the way down and is dried up, right? Look at the feed intake. Feed intake is low during early lactation, and then peaks during mid lactation, and then comes down again in late lactation, right? And then body weight, right? Say there's a rapid decline in body weight and body condition score, which we will talk about shortly. And then the animal slowly gains it, and then after a certain point in late lactation the body weight gain increases, right? Because the production levels go down, and the animal can afford to divert energy towards regaining this body weight, right? Right. And then something that's not mentioned here is the reproductive management. So where do you think the farmer has to intervene as far as reproduction goes? This group, or this group? So it should be here. So the animal calves right here, right? Calving is right here. And this is where that open period we talked about is, right? So the shorter the open period, better, right? But of course, you can't get animals pregnant within 4 weeks, right? So usually we leave at least 60 days for the animal to recover from the previous pregnancy, right? Uterus has to involute, all that, right? Um, so, um, so this is that critical period. So by having them in early lactation as single group, and maybe then even further categorizing them as conceived and non-conceived, right? So you can become more efficient in the management, reproductive management of these animals, right? So if I ask you a question on, uh, compare and contrast these three phases or whatever, you need to cover all these aspects, not only milk production, not only diet, right? Not only body condition, but also reproductive management. And there might be certain other things also which I want you to read up on. Okay, so like this curve showed, right? So peak lactation takes place during this first phase, right, which we call early lactation, or the first 100 days. But you'll notice, right, so under different farming systems, with different management system, with different breeds and different climatic systems, right, the peak lactation, can change from place to place, from farm to farm, from breed to breed. Right, so according to this graph, right, peak lactation takes place somewhere around 2.5 months. 1 month, 2 months, 2.5 months, which is like 10 weeks, right? 8 to 10 weeks, right? However, if you look at the different breeds, so this shows um, lactation yield in Holstein Friesians, comparing the first three parities, right? So this first parity, second parity, and third parity, right? You see there's a huge difference between first and second parities, right? So first parity milk yield is relatively low. However, the decline is not so prominent, right? So it maintains a relative plateau for a longer period, right? However, during second and third parities, there is we usually say you can get about 25-30% more milk than the first parity, right? Say peak is 30 liters here, here 40 liters, so that's 30% more, right? And however, you'll notice here these according to this chart, right, the peak is somewhere around here, right? So maybe on this one the peak is somewhere here, you know so earlier we said 10 weeks. 10 weeks is like 70 days, right? So maybe you could call the peak is here, which is about 70 days, maybe. 50 days, 100 days, 75 here, right? So peak is around there, right? But as you go towards second and third lactation, right? So peak is close to, right, somewhere around here, okay, somewhere around here, which is about 40 to 50 days, which is 6 to 7 weeks, right? So peak is probably somewhere around here, right? um, and so three groups: early lactation, mid lactation, and late lactation would be at 100 and 200 days, right? So you see, so every month we expect a decline of about 8 to 12%. Of course, as a good farm manager, a good veterinarian, your goal is to keep the decline, close to 8%, not towards 12%, right? So 12% decline is, rapid decline, but you want to try and keep it around 8%. So if the animal gave 40 liters at peak, right? So every month, if it was a 10% reduction, so next month it will be 36. Next month it will be uh, take off the 3.6, something like 32.4, right? And then next month 29, next month 26 point something, something like that. So there is a 8 to 12% decline every month, right? Okay. So here are some examples, right? So if the peak yield was 15 liters, right? See, if there was a 8%, 10%, or 12% decline, depending on the decline, the total lactation yield can vary considerably, right? So if it was only a 8% decline, the animal will go on to give around 3000 liters. But if it was a 12% decline every month, right, animal will go on to give only 2,300. So 650 liter difference times 100 rupees, 65,000 rupees, right? So that's a huge quantity, right? So let's look at a 25 liter animal, right? The difference is again 5,000, 3,800, right? So 1,100 liters almost different, right? Which is 110,000 rupees at 100 rupees a liter. Certain farms in Sri Lanka get as much as 120, certain farms get as low as 70, so I just average it out at 100 for convenience. So remember, now sometimes when I ask people, okay, if an animal gave 20 liters during their peak lactation, what do you expect their lactation yield to be? They multiply 20 by 300, because 300 days, 305 days is the usual lactation length we talk about, and they tell me 6,000 liters. No, that is incorrect. So remember, this is at peak, right? So this is the peak lactation, right? But either side of it is lower than that. So to multiply this by 300 is not correct, right? But what is considered is to multiply this by 200 gives you a it gives you an approximate lactation yield, provided the drop was not too bad, right? So if it was 8% decline, it's approximately 15 times 200, 3,000. If it was a 12% decline, it's approximately 15 times 150. 15 times 150 is 2,250. Same here. 20 times 200, 4,000. 20 times 150, 3,000. 25 times 200 is 5,000. 25 times 150 is 3,750, right? So if you know the peak, you can estimate the total yield by multiplying it by 150 for rapid decline or 200 for good management conditions. But extremely good management conditions, they say you can even multiply this by 220, right? So remember that the total yield is something like 150 to 200 times of the peak lactation, because sometimes that's a question you get asked by farmers. So this animal gave 20 liters at the peak, but do I expect it to give for the whole lactation, right? So that's something you can also use when purchasing animals who have, peaked. You can say, okay, this animal can be estimated to give this quantity, therefore, this is the value I'm prepared to pay for the animal. Right? So you should have a basic understanding of that, right? Okay, so I might give you a question. Say, okay, an animal gave 20 liters, right? I won't give these numbers. I'll give you some different numbers. I'll say, animal gave 30 liters during peak, right? Went on to lactate the entire 305 days, right? What kind of a total lactation yield would you expect? And therefore, what is the average milk daily yield you expect, right? So you can divide this number by 305 and you get this, right? So you have to have a basic understanding on that. Right. So we in the previous chart we looked at the different parities, right? And then here we look at different breeds, right? Okay. So look at Jersey. Obviously, Jersey animals are lower producers, right? And Holstein Friesians higher producers, right? Of course, see, I mean here, so like I said earlier, right? So depending on the breed, depending on the management system, depending on the country, depending on the climate, uh, depending on how much you let them eat, right? The how soon or late you achieve peak and how long the peak lasts, right? All depends, and how much the decline is. So you can appreciate that the decline here is much faster than the decline here, right? So earlier graph animal peak lactation was 30, first parity, second third it was 40. Yeah, it's that. So like, so don't hang on to these numbers, huh? So this depends on the country, the era. So this was 2008. From this there's 13, 14, 15 years ago, right? So numbers change, right? So rapid decline here, right? So the idea here is the take-home message here is, there are breed differences, there are parity differences, and however, generally speaking, all these breeds show the same pattern, right? So they peak around, 7, 8 weeks, 6, 7, 8 weeks, right? And then there is a decline, relatively similar decline, right, during between these two animals. And then, by around 300 days, it really, goes down. If you keep on lactating animals, they will go on to produce, they have the capacity to produce even up to 500 days or beyond. However, from a financial, economical, business point of view, that is not recommended. We want another peak here as soon as possible, right? So that is the take home message here, right? Okay. So remember we were looking at total milk yield here, right? Daily milk yield. And if you look at the protein plus fat yield, so in Sri Lanka, right, we still that's not entirely true. We do look at the quality of milk, right, which is fat. We mainly look at fat, right? But then it's debatable whether the black milk collectors actually look at the fat or the volume. That's a whole different story, which I'm not going to talk about now, right? But there are certain countries they look at the protein yield or the protein and fat combined yield, right? So they follow a similar pattern. But what's more important here is I might ask you, okay, so you can probably tell me this. If I ask you, okay, how much is the daily milk production of an animal? You can probably tell me this, right? But what you may not be able to tell me is what if I ask you what the protein or fat yield of a cow will be? You may not be able to tell me, right? So this says so you can get uh, as much as 2 kilos of protein plus fat a day from a cow, right? That's a lot. 2 kilos. Is that correct? Right? Do you think that's correct? How can you do a calculation and see if that is correct? Okay, I'll pause the video, do a calculation from your existing knowledge and see if you can get these numbers. Okay, I hope you have done your calculation. Right, so we'll come back to that, right? So you need to basically know the protein percentage and fat percentage of a liter of milk. If you know that, you can do that. So if you still haven't done it, now that I have given you a hint, pause the video and do the calculation and see if you get these answers, right? So we saw the parity breed differences as well as the similarities. So this study from 2016, right? So they go on to look at the lactation curve based on season of calving in Holsteins, and you can see, right? Um, autumn, fall calving, right? The milk yield is slightly higher, right? However, the pattern is more or less the same. Right? So although it's against natural um, curve, then again I'm not, yeah, so right, but what you need to, so although I said fall is higher, that is just a observation. I haven't done any statistics. Ideally you need to say that after doing statistics. Now that you all have done statistics, right, you have to see if that is a statistically significant difference, right? Okay, the difference between spring and autumn. Okay, right. um right, so we saw, right, second and third parity were higher than first parity. But how long does it go on for? Fourth parity is higher than third parity, fifth parity is higher, sixth parity is higher, or does it come down at a certain level, right? So this is milk yield, mean 305-day milk yield uh, for parities 1, 2, 3, 4 and higher than 5. So you will see here, you know, the increases 8,000, 9,700, 10,000, 10,800, and it drops, right? But like, again, statistics come into play. You cannot make such statements just by looking at numbers, right? So this is where you need statistics. Are these statistics different? Indeed, they are. See, different letters A, B, C, D denote significant differences at P less than 1%, right? So A, B, C, D are different, but what shows here is after 5, right? So they take milk yields after 5 in the same group. They are not different to fourth lactation, right? So they are still higher than C, A, B, C, first, second, and third. However, they are not higher than fourth lactation. Right? So it doesn't mean they are lower either. If they were lower, you'll get a different number here. You'll either get A, B, C or an E, right? However, they are not low, they are not different. So the absolute number here is different. However, they are not statistically significant, right? That you need to understand, right? Not going to spend more time on that because this is not a statistics lecture, but you need to understand that if you don't know this, right, please refresh or brush up your knowledge on this. That is important. Right, so I talked about the fat percentages and the protein percentages briefly. Now, so the take-home message from what I'm trying to show you within the next few slides is that there is no set value, right? All these figures depend on the breeds, right? So you see they are different for each breed. Holstein lactation yield is that. So this is in Canada. This is not old information. This is relatively new information, right? Almost 11,000 kilos, right? Um, Jersey is 7,000. Shorthorn, right? Guernsey, Brown Swiss, Ayrshire, right? So that's the lactation yield. Look at the fat percentage. 4% Jersey, we all know, high fat. 5%, 4.7, right? So on. Protein, protein is relatively more constant than fat. Doesn't fluctuate a lot because with the protein you can have as low as 4% and as high as 5%, 5 plus. You'll see in the next few slides there are breeds in certain countries that give as much as 6% or more, right? But protein is relatively steady, 3.3, right, 3.4, right? So Jersey again has high protein. So this is why, right, even if the lactation yield is lower, right, the farmer might still be able to make more money if he's paid by protein and fat, right? So remember that. So just because the Holstein Friesian animals give you more milk, it doesn't mean they are more profitable, right? Because these animals can give more protein and fat, as well as small animals they eat less, right? Maintenance is relatively free. As far as our climate goes, they are more suitable to our climate, more tropical country resistant, right? So those kinds of things, right? So okay, so these figures are from Canada. Now let's look at some figures from different countries: Canada, US, South Korea, Denmark, right? Okay, let's look at Jersey. So these were the numbers we saw in the earlier slide, right? United States, right? So in Canada, say 10,900, US 11,600, so almost 700 kilos more, right? That's about 5% more milk, 6% more milk. Fat is lower than Canada, so is protein is more or less the same, 3.27, 3.31. Now look at Denmark, Holstein. Milk yield is slightly lower but higher than Canada. Look at fat is higher, protein is higher. Right now, let's look at jerseys. Canada, 7,000, 5.17, 3.87. US, higher yield, slightly lower fat and protein. Denmark, 6% fat, 4.27% protein. Right? So even higher than Canada. So that's what I'm trying to show you, right? So this doesn't happen randomly, right? How do you think this has happened? Big difference. 6% fat versus 4.88, 4.27 protein versus 3.85 protein. What do you think is causing this difference? Huh? Pause the video and think for a second. Right, so I'm sure some of you all said genetic, you can't say breed differences because the same breed, right? But they can be different families, different lines, different pedigrees, right? And they have been bred, they have been selected for these traits, right? So I already showed you during heifer selection, calf selection lectures that you can select bulls based on their, daughter milk yield, daughter fat percentage, daughter protein percentage, right? So if these guys, if the Danish national policy said, okay, every country has a breeding policy, right? So maybe their national breeding policy says, you have to breed, you have to select semen of bulls with predicted transmitting abilities of more than 6% fat or 5.5% fat, right? So that's what causes these differences. This that cannot happen overnight. This cannot happen within a decade, right? But over many decades, 50, 60, 100 years, this can happen. You can see such dramatic differences between within the same breed, but within different countries, within different ecosystems, and so on. Right. So the take-home message here, I'm not expecting you to, memorize these figures for each country, each breed, right? But what I do expect you from you is to give me a ballpark figure. If I ask you what the typical protein percentage of milk is, if you tell me 2.5 or 4%, 4.5, wrong answer, right? So I'm expecting somewhere around 3.3 to 3.5. Similarly, with fat also, I will ask you the Jersey versus Holstein Friesian, you should be able to give me a uh, acceptable answer, right? Okay. So I hope all that is clear, and I hope whoever did not do that previous calculation of protein yield plus fat yield per liter per day, right, you'll be able to give me a decent answer, right, by after looking at this slide, right? Okay. Um, right. So now, see, look at this column. It says milk per recorded cow in 305 days, right? So what does it mean? It means multiple things here, right? So not all cows are subjected to milk recording. So the general term we use in the field is milk recording. When we say milk recording, that means recording of lactation data, uh, you know, in animals, right? So in Sri Lanka, this is not done, right? In certain countries, they do it every day for every animal, right? In certain countries, they don't do every day for every animal, but they will do it periodically, right? So anyway, you have to have some kind of recording. It's not easy task. It's not an easy task. Like you have 1,000 animals to measure their milk volume every day, practically very difficult. I mean, and economically, from a business point of view, not required, and it can incur so many costs and time investment, right? labor investment. So therefore, not many people do it, right? But however, in certain nowadays there are automated systems, right? So the moment the animal walks into the milking parlor, it has a electronic chip, ID identification chip, right? And then the machine recognizes, okay, this animal Sumana today gave 25 liters, yesterday she gave 28, so the recording will be automatically recorded, right? Milk yield. Same happens to protein percentage, fat percentage, auto analyzer, right? Sometimes it doesn't, they don't do this for individual animals, but they would do it for the bulk tank, right? So it's in the field situation, it's a little more complicated than a table like this, right? So anyway, the 2 points I wanted to make sure show you here is, it says milk per recorded cow, right? So the non-recorded cows, I'm pretty sure the averages would be the same, right? But but this calculation only takes into consideration the numbers from recorded cows, right? And then it also says 305 days. Now, do you think all of these animals lactated exactly 305 days and they were dried off on the 305th or 6th day? Right? No, that is not practically possible. So what they do is they use something called a 3052XME, right? So before we define that, what do you think will be different differences among these animals, different breeds, different countries, right? So for one, like I said earlier, certain animals may have only milked up to 280 days. Some animals would have given only up to 150 days. Does it mean just because this animal gave only 280 days, you are going to discard that data, right? Or so another animal lactated 350 days, didn't get pregnant, therefore had a long intercalving interval, long lactation period, went on to give milk for 380 days. Are you going to discard that data just because it didn't stop lactation exactly at 305 days, right? Okay, some of these animals were milked only once a day, some were milked twice a day, some were milked thrice a day. Do you think that once a day versus twice a day versus thrice a day milking has an effect on the total yield, right? So let's say identical twins, right? Same management, same nutrition, same farm, same climate, same everything. One animal was milked once a day, the other animal was milked twice a day. Which animal will give more milk at the end of the 305 days? The animal that was milked twice a day. Why? Because in the animal that was milked once a day, what do you think happens? What causes reduction of total milk yield? Take a second. If you answered negative inhibition at the level of the mammary glands, you got it right, right? Because when you have done your biochemistry, all the pathways, right? You see negative feedback inhibition all the time, negative feedback loops, right? If your mammary glands are full of milk, there will be a signal going up to the milk secreting alveolar cells, say, okay, we are full, pause or halt production for now until we are empty, right? So then only after the animal is milked next day morning, because they're being milked once a day, alveolar cells will start to secrete milk again. But in the animal that is milked twice or thrice a day, milk is being removed faster, therefore negative feedback inhibition is removed quickly, right? So therefore that animal will go on to produce more milk, right? So but that doesn't mean we should throw away that valuable data point in a calculation like this, right? So that is why they have come up with this thing called 3052XME, which stands for 305 days, twice a day milking, milk equivalent, right? So they standardize everything, whether they are milked once a day, twice a day, thrice a day, or whether they lactate at 150 days, 200 days, 250 days, 300, 305, 400 days. They standardize everything into this, right? So the definition is the lactation record for a cow with a minimum of 50 days in milk and is extended to 305 days, adjusted for location, age, season of calving uh, to a mature cow basis adjusted to twice a day milking, right? Okay, so that is what this is, right? So you need to remember, this is not a simple calculation. Let's say if one animal milk 150 days gave 3000 liters, right? That doesn't mean 305 days is 3000 times 2, right? Because as you can recall, the first 150 days it produces more milk, right? So next 150 days it doesn't produce more milk, right? So it's not a simple calculation like that. It's a complex calculation. There are, series of formulas, right? So you have to factor in all of those when doing this calculation, right? Okay, so we have talked about some of the fundamentals, right? We have talked about these, right? So now, right now, this chart we saw as a single chart. It's been broken up into milk production, feed intake, dry matter intake, and body weight, right? So you should know what happens in each of these phases. What are the characteristic features of each of these phases, right? We have seen this, and I also mentioned about the open period and the reproductive management, right? So one thing important here is this that we have not talked about, right? So you notice here the animal produces peak milk in early lactation, right? However, the feed intake peaks in mid lactation. Kind of doesn't make sense, right? If the animal peak milk production was in early lactation, it would make sense for the animal's feed intake also to peak in par with the milk production, right? However, that is not how it works for some reason, right? Some reason we will talk about that later, right? So because of this natural phenomenon, right? So this resembles energy input or output, energy output, right? Energy required to produce milk, and this represents energy input, right? So because of this disparity, right, energy input is lower. So that's the energy input. Huh? Energy ingested or energy input to the animal is lower than the energy output from milk during this phase, right? So how can that be, right? If you have, I can't eat 50 kilojoules and give out 100 kilojoules, can I? Any biological system, whether it's a tree, a cell, a human being, a protozoa, a COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, or car engine, right? No system is 100% efficient. Efficiency is always lower than 100%. So if efficiency is 100 less than 100%, that means output cannot be higher than input. Input is always higher than output, right? If you give somebody 100 of anything, you won't get 100, right? Whether it's food, uh, or studies or love, right? It's hard to get back the entire 100, right? You'll get less than what you give. Hopefully not love for you, right? But so then how can this be? So that is different to all the fundamental principles. You give the animal, let's say here, uh, 15 megacalories worth of energy, and the animal gives you 22. That sounds like a fantastic deal, right? How is that possible? Now think about it for a second. Pause the video and think about it. Right? Okay. So if you thought, okay, animal does that by mobilizing stored energy in the body, you answered right. Right. So what happens during this phase is animal uses energy stored as body fat, right? Animal mobilizes energy from this body fat and uses that energy to produce milk, right? So but what that does is mobilizing means body fat storages are broken down, converted to energy, right, and used here, which means body fat levels go down, right? Now that might be a good thing for somebody like me, with a big stomach, right? But for a dairy cow, I don't know if that is such a big thing, good thing, right? So this is reflected as the body condition score. We say animals' body condition score goes down because animals' body fat resources are being depleted, right? So this is a cycle. This happens every cycle during the early lactation phase, right? Animal will mobilize stored body fat resources and use for milk production. And then in the mid lactation and late lactation periods, animals intake goes above output, right? So gives the animal a chance to replenish, to restore those sources that were previously used up. Okay, I hope that is clear, right? So here the body stores were used for production of milk, but during mid and late lactation, animal restores those depleted reserves and stored as body fat for the next cycle, right? So during the next lactation, whatever that was stored here will again be used up for production of milk, right? So I hope that is clear. This goes on every cycle, right? So this is, you cannot prevent this, right? However much you feed, animals have been selected for this, right? Dairy cows have been selected over centuries and centuries for their ability to mobilize body fat. However, they can only do it to a certain extent. If you just let the animal be, okay, this animal is a highly profitable animal, however much its milk production capacities it will produce by mobilizing its body fat stores. I'm not going to feed you anything, cow, a loving cow. You keep on producing milk with your body fat stores. I won't feed you anything because you have stored so much energy during your previous lactation, late lactation period. So that does not work, right? If you keep doing, if you stress the system too much, right, so the animal will have a high risk of getting sick, right? So the certain group of diseases here, we will talk about those later, right? So remember that, right? So this period we call the negative energy balance. The animal has a negative energy balance, and here animal has a positive energy balance, where after the input, ingested energy is greater than energy spent, right? So that is a positive energy balance, but most of it is negative energy balance, right? Okay. Um, right, right. So remember, when if they lose the body conditions go too much, right? There is a risk of becoming too thin and diseased, and fertility also suffers, right? So for animals to be fertile, to get pregnant, right? Remember that open period that we talked about? If you want to keep the open period relatively short, you have to you have to keep the you have to control the loss of body condition score. If there is excessive loss of body condition, right, then you won't be able to get the animal pregnant soon enough. Okay, so keep that in mind. Right. Okay, so then what are the numbers? So I said it shouldn't go below a certain level. What are these numbers? What is the number here? What is the lowest number recommended? What is the highest number recommended? When should you regain this high number, right? Is it during mid lactation? Is it during late lactation? Is it during dry period, right? So this slide shows you some key body conditions correlated targets, right? What you should have at calving, what should be the maximum loss, right? And so on, right? So read up on this, and you will also see that different countries recommend different uh, ranges, right? So according to this, right? So this the accepted one generally in the Australia New Zealand region, 3.25 at the point of carving, right? um, and but if you look at the US documents, it's slightly different, right? So US documents are about 0.25 higher than that, right? So they would say, so these uh, US Purdue University, right? So their recommendations are average 3.5 minimum, 3.25 to 3.75 maximum, right? But here Australian recommendation, average 3.25, minimum 3 to 3.5 is the range, but here 0.25 higher. But you need to have a generally good idea of this. I might ask you, what is the lowest body condition score you can expect, right? um, during peak milk production, so on. So you have to have an idea, when do they regain the 3.5 or 3.25 back, when do they have the lowest body condition score, what is the best time period for regaining lost body condition score, and so on and so forth, right? Right, so just read up on these, what happens by advantages and disadvantages of maintaining optimal body conditions. So remember, I told you earlier, right, um, about the production, reproduction aspects of different stages. So all these are interconnected, right? So look at these different diseases, right? So these you need to be aware of, right? Right. Now, body condition score is, there are three different systems used the world over. Sri Lanka uses a 5-point scale, right? So the poorest body condition scores close to 1, highest body condition scores close to 5, right? So 1 to 5 scale, but there are also 8-point and 10-point scales of body condition scoring as well, right? But regardless of the scale, the pattern is this, right? The pattern is this, gets lowest body condition score around peak milk production, which was, maybe said 6 7 weeks, 50 days, right? Okay. Now, this is really important. I'm not going to go through these slides. You will have to self-study this. You can't. This is not something you can gain during a lecture. You have to go to a farm. We have already done this. We may have already done this at lecture at farm, right? Depending on the group, right? So this is something you need to practice at a farm by looking at this. The theoretical aspect, right? So I have these are straight copy and paste from this web URL, right? So this is at Cornell University. However, this is being produced by a company called Elanco, right? You can download it using this link, right? So there are certain anatomical landmarks we use, right? Hook bone, pin bone, tail head ligament, thurl, right? There's something called thurl, right? And then sacral ligaments, so on, right? So your first job is to categorize by looking at the third, whether the animal is having a body condition score of lower than 3 or higher than 3, right? So if it's lower than 3, the third has a V shape. If it's higher than 3, the third has a U shape, right? You don't get this angle at this corner, right? So depending on that, right, that is your first, that is where you start. Afterwards, if it's lower than 3, you know, you look at these criteria. I'm not going to go through those in detail now, right? And based on that, if that is the observation, it's 3. If this observation is 2.75, if that is the observation, it's 2.5, less than 2.75, and so on and so forth. You can go on till less than 2, right? But if it was U-shaped, then it is above 3. Then you look at certain other anatomical landmarks, right? So if you see this, it's 3.25. That is what you see, it's 3.5. If that is what you see, it's 3.75 or higher, and so on, Right. So I strongly urge you to download this guide from this web URL and to, practice that at a farm until you're thoroughly familiar, because that's really important to be able to um, evaluate body condition score by 0.25 scale, right? 0.25, so that you can correlate all those with those body condition score, uh, the key figures that I talked about, right? Um, right. So it's almost like a KPI, right? So if you cannot evaluate body condition score properly, you can't say, okay, is this animal being properly fed or not, or if something is going wrong. You cannot say any of that without being able to give evaluate the body condition score properly, right? So this is a really important skill to develop, right? So earlier I said, you should try to keep the body condition loss to no more than zero point 0.5, right? However, in reality, there are animals that lose less than zero point 0.5 or even more than zero point 0.5 or more than 1. See what happens. So when the body condition loss is higher, right? Body condition loss is higher. First day to ovulation is higher. Day to first heat is higher. First service is higher, right? First service conception rate is lower, right? Services per conception higher, right? Okay. So again, statistics. So think about what's meant here. A, B, right? A, B, what does this mean, right? So think about those, right? So that is why we have to try and maintain the loss of body condition to less than zero point 0.5, right? So if the animal was 3.25 at calving, we should try to keep the body condition loss to no more than 2.75. If it goes below 2.75, then you might have trouble animal getting pregnant and other various stuff, right? Okay, so something you need to memorize almost is, uh, generally each unit of body condition score, that means 4 to 3 or 3 to 2 or 5 to 4, each unit, right, is usually about 8% of the body weight. So if it's a 500 kilogram animal, right, if the animal loses body condition score from 4 to 3, how many kilos of fat is that? 8% of 500 kilos, that's about how much? Okay, you do that calculation, and generally it is also about 1 centimeter of back fat, right? So you see, these are animal with high or poor body condition score. A very high body condition score, this is an animal with poor body condition score. And you see, for loss of each body condition score, right, see, from 2 to 3, body fat 10 10 millimeters, 3 to 4, another 10, right? So generally about 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter for a unit of body condition score, right? And number of kilos, like I said, about 8%. So you do the calculation and see. And remember, this is not for all animals. This is for generally about 500, 600 kilogram animals. This won't be the same for local animals weighing 350 kilos. It won't be the same for massive animals with 1,200 kilogram bulls either. This is for 600, 700 kilo animals. Generally, this is a rule of thumb, but it's not written in concrete, right? Okay, so now that you have a generally good understanding of body condition score, see if you can um, draw the fluctuation of body condition score during these different phases, right? So note that the previous charts that we studied started at calving. Now here I have deliberately started this at mid lactation to see what you will come up with, right? So don't worry about getting this perfect. Don't I mean don't look at the don't refer the previous slides. So try to draw this up from whatever you have understood so far, and then go back to the previous slides to see if you got it correct. Right. So we talked about most of these things briefly. The open period, we said that was the interval between carving to reconception, right? Carving to reconception period. So this is essentially a non-pregnant period, right? And then we divided this into voluntary waiting period and a breeding period, right? I'm not going to go through each detail here, but this generally is a period where we don't breed the animal. We voluntarily, right, wait, right? We voluntarily wait. We, even if the animal comes to heat, sometimes animals do come to heat, right? We skip it. We skip it, and generally about 45 to 60 days, we don't make an effort to breed. We keep them away from the bull or inseminator. We do, even if they come into heat, we just let them rest. Right? So think why we do that, right? So these are self-explanatory, right? So if the animal becomes pregnant or conceives with the very first breeding, very first AI or natural breeding, voluntary waiting period equals open period. But unfortunately, that is not how reality works. In some certain cases, doesn't conceive with the first breeding, 21 days, doesn't conceive with the second breeding. If you're lucky, it'll conceive on the third breeding, but sometimes there will be animals that you'll have to do a fourth breeding. Also, if nothing works, sometimes you just cull these animals who are resistant to get conceived, right? So that's just how nature works, right? Right. So in such a case, open period is much longer than the voluntary waiting period. But in this case, open period was the same as the voluntary waiting period, right? Right. So some new information, relatively new information. So read this also. Not new anymore, 10 years now, right? So learn about this reproduction information. So I'm not going to go into details. These lectures will be covered. Regardless, do visit these, do read this at your leisure. Right. So this open period, right? I said we wait for 60 days. Some animals may come to heat, some animals won't, right? So there is a period of anestrus. Right? So this is we call this the postpartum anestrus interval, right? So there are other anestrus periods in cows, right? So those are the ones, examples, right? And this is a postpartum uh, interval, right? Postpartum anestrus interval. Right? So why do they need this? I asked this question earlier. If you said, okay, the uterus needs a rest, uterus needs to get back to normal. Now the uterus has been highly expanded and morphologically, physiologically, changed, challenged. It needs a rest to go back to normalcy to be able to accept another pregnancy, right? So see, there is about a 12 times expansion of the uterus weight. So this is not excluding the fetus. Fetus is 30 40 kilos. So this 10 kilograms is only the uterine tissue, right? It has to come back to 800 grams or whatever, and this doesn't happen overnight. So until then, there is a refractory period or a resting period or restoration of the uterus, right? So that is why animal will not come into heat these days, postpartum anestrus, right? And even the hormones, they have to come back to normal, right? So this postpartum uh, anestrus interval, it is dependent on so many things here, comparing to Bos indicus breeds, Nallur, and Cimental, right? Bos indicus versus Bos taurus, right? So this is actually also a tropical scene in countries like Italy, right? So see what you can understand with this, right? So breed is one thing, and it also, there are other factors also that affect the length of this, right? Okay, so that concludes this section, right? The is kind of like an introduction to the lactating animal, right? The dairy cow, right? So we will cover the milking management, dry period, transition period, etc., 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 in future lectures. Okay, thank you very much.